Welcome, traveler. Come, settle by the fire for another tale. Let me tell you about the mutiny at Dead Man's Cove. It happened when I was trapped with 200 pirates, all of them ready to kill each other, and me caught in the middle with nowhere to run. A pirate fortress carved into volcanic cliffs where the only law was the captain's word. The merchant ship I was traveling on never stood a chance. 3 masts, 40 crew, gone in minutes when the pirates struck at dawn. But Captain Bloodtide didn't kill his prisoners. He kept us alive for a reason, and that reason would turn a simple kidnapping into the bloodiest month of my very long life. So pour yourself something strong, dear friend. This tale has teeth, and by the end, you'll understand why some choices haunt you forever. I was traveling to the Thornspire Islands on the merchant vessel Sea's Promise, bound for the ancient libraries of Coral Gate, where I hoped to study runes that predated the First Kingdoms. The ship was nothing special. Sturdy oak and honest crew, the sort that had carried trade goods across these waters for generations without incident. We never saw them coming. The attack came at dawn, 3 ships appearing out of the morning mist like ghosts made solid, black sails, iron prows, and the red banner of Captain Aldrich Marin, known throughout these waters as Bloodtide. The merchant captain, a decent man named Willem Harwick, tried to run. But you don't outrun pirate ships in these waters, not when they know every current, every wind pattern, every hiding place among the scattered islands. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Long enough for 3 of our crew to die fighting. Long enough for the rest to understand that surrender was the only choice that kept them breathing. When the boarding planks dropped and the pirates swarmed aboard, I found myself face to face with Captain Bloodtide himself. He was not what I'd expected. Tall, certainly, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent decades fighting wind and wave. But his eyes held something I hadn't seen in many pirates. Intelligence, and something else. Something that looked almost like pain. Well, he said, studying me with those dark eyes. A wizard. Been a long time since we've taken a wizard. Captain, I said carefully, I have no quarrel with you or your crew. I'm simply a scholar, traveling to study old books, hardly worth the trouble of... Oh, you're worth trouble, he interrupted, and there was something in his voice, a weariness that spoke of burdens I couldn't yet understand. More trouble than you know, but also more useful than you know. He turned to his crew. Chain him. Iron shackles, the ones with the runes carved deep, and treat him well. We're going to need him healthy where we're going. The iron shackles were unpleasant, not just the weight of them, but the way they seemed to drink the magic from my bones, leaving me feeling hollow and weak. The runes carved into the metal were old, older than most kingdoms, and they'd been crafted by someone who understood exactly how to cage a wizard's power. Where are you taking me? I asked as they secured the chains. Captain Bloodtide looked out over the water toward a cluster of distant islands shrouded in perpetual mist. Home, he said simply, to Dead Man's Cove. The journey took 3 days. 3 days during which I learned that Captain Bloodtide's crew was different from what I'd expected. Oh, they were pirates, certainly. Hard men and women who'd chosen a life of taking from others. But they were also organized, disciplined. They didn't rape or torture their captives, didn't kill for sport, didn't burn ships just to watch them sink. "The captain has rules," explained the quartermaster, a stern woman called Isla, the Ironheart. She was perhaps 40 years old, with scars on her hands that spoke of countless sword fights and grey streaking her dark hair. "Break the rules, and you go over the side, follow them, and you eat well and share in the profits." "What sort of rules?" I asked. "No killing without cause, no harming women or children, no burning settlements. Just take what we need and leave them able to rebuild. The captain says dead merchants don't carry cargo next season." It was practical, ruthless but practical, and it explained why Captain Bloodtide's crew was large and well-equipped, while other pirate bands struggled to maintain a single ship. But as we sailed toward the hidden stronghold, I began to notice things, small things. The way the crew watched their captain when they thought he wasn't looking. The whispered conversations that stopped when officers approached. The tension that seemed to thicken like fog around the ship. Something was wrong. Something more than just the usual stresses of pirate life. On the second day, I overheard an argument between two of the crew. They thought I was asleep in my corner of the hold, but iron shackles don't make for comfortable rest. "Telling you, Gareth, something's not right with the captain," one was saying. His name was Marcus, a young man barely out of his teens with the quick eyes of someone who'd learned early that survival meant watching everything. "Keep your voice down," hissed the other, Gareth Red Sails, the first mate. A man with copper hair and a reputation for violence that even other pirates respected. "You want to end up feeding the fish." Look at him, though. Look at his hands. They shake when he thinks no one's watching. And those headaches. When's the last time you saw the captain eat a full meal? "The captain's fine. The captain's dying." The words hung in the salt air like a curse. And perhaps they were. "Even if that's true," Gareth said finally, "it changes nothing. We follow orders. We do our jobs. We don't ask questions that'll get us killed. But what happens when he can't give orders anymore? What happens to the crew? To the Cove?" Gareth was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been thinking the same thoughts. "We do what pirates have always done," he said. "We survive." But there was something in his voice, something that suggested survival might require choices that even pirates found distasteful. On the third day, we reached Dead Man's Cove. I had heard stories of pirate strongholds, hidden bases where the sea wolves gathered to divide their plunder and plan their raids. But Dead Man's Cove was magnificent in its own terrible way. The cove itself was a crack in the face of a massive volcanic island, invisible from the open sea, accessible only through an underwater passage that required precise timing with the tides. Miss the window, and the crushing rock would claim your ship and everyone aboard. But inside was a marvel of engineering and audacity. The Pirates had carved a city into the living rock of the volcano. Docks and warehouses at water level, connected by rope bridges and stone staircases to workshops and armories carved higher up the cliff face. And at the very top, overlooking the entire complex, the captain's quarters built into what had once been the mouth of the volcano itself. 200 years of work, Captain Bloodtide told me as we sailed through the entrance passage. Started by my grandfather's grandfather, expanded by every generation since. No king's navy has ever found us here. No rival crew has ever successfully attacked these walls. It was impressive, but it was also something else. It was a trap, a maze of stone and rope and narrow passages where a few defenders could hold off an army, but where the defenders themselves could never easily escape. "How many men?" I asked, watching the activity on the docks as crews from a dozen ships went about their business. 200, give or take, the captain replied. Men and women from every corner of the known seas. Deserters from royal navies, refugees from wars, merchants who lost everything to corrupt nobles. All sorts, really, united by one thing, which is... His smile was sharp as a blade. They have nowhere else to go. As we docked at the stone quay, I could see what he meant. These weren't the savage raiders of legend. These were people who'd made a calculated decision that the risks of piracy were preferable to whatever they'd left behind. They moved with purpose, maintained their equipment with care, and showed the kind of discipline that spoke of military training. But I could also see the cracks in their unity, the way certain groups clustered together, the careful space maintained between different factions, the watchful eyes that never quite seemed to trust what they were seeing. Captain Bloodtide saw me studying his people. "Wondering about loyalty, wizard?" he asked quietly. "Wondering what keeps them from cutting my throat and taking my share?" The thought had occurred to me. "Fear," he said simply. "Fear of what happens if they kill the one man who knows how to hold this place together. Fear of the alternatives waiting for them out there in the world. Fear of each other." He paused, and for a moment, the weariness I'd glimpsed earlier showed clearly on his weathered face. But fear only works as long as the thing they're afraid of losing seems worth keeping. And lately... He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. I could see it in the way his hand trembled slightly as he gripped the ship's rail, in the lines of pain around his eyes, in the careful way he moved, like a man whose body was betraying him one piece at a time. Captain Bloodtide was dying, and when he died, the careful balance of fear and respect that held Dead Man's Cove together would die with him. My quarters were surprisingly comfortable. A stone chamber carved into the cliff face, with a proper bed, a writing desk, and even a small window that looked out over the hidden harbor. The iron shackles remained, but they'd been attached to a chain long enough to allow me to move freely around the room. "Captain's orders," explained the guard who brought my evening meal. His name was Thomas, a middle-aged man with the calloused hands of a former ship's carpenter. "Says you're to be treated as a guest, not a prisoner." "A guest who can't leave," I pointed out. Thomas shrugged. "Guests don't usually want to leave the cove once they understand what's waiting for them out there. Pirates. We're honest about what we take from people, kings and merchants. They call it taxes and fair trade, but the result's the same. Your purse gets lighter, their coffers get heavier. It was an argument I'd heard before, from bandits and rebels, and anyone who made their living taking from others. Sometimes it was even true, but it didn't change the fact that I was a prisoner in a place where the wrong word or gesture could get a man killed. Over the following days, I began to understand the rhythm of life in Dead Man's Cove. Ships came and went, bringing news and plunder from across the seas. Crews shared information about merchant routes, naval patrols, the movements of potential targets. Plans were made, supplies allocated, new raids organized, and through it all, Captain Bloodtide held court in his chamber at the top of the fortress, making decisions that affected the lives of everyone in the cove, settling disputes, dividing treasure, maintaining the delicate balance that kept his people unified. But the signs of his failing health were becoming harder to hide. The tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. The way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence and pressed his fingers to his temples. The careful way he moved, like every step caused him pain. The crew was beginning to notice, and more importantly, they were beginning to choose sides. It was Isla the Ironheart who first explained the situation to me. She came to my chamber on the 5th night, ostensibly to check on my condition, but really I suspected because she needed someone to talk to, someone outside the poisonous politics that were dividing the crew. "You're wondering why the captain keeps you alive," she said, settling into the room's single chair while I remained seated on the bed. The thought had crossed my mind. He thinks you might be able to help with his condition. I'm not a healer. My magic doesn't work that way. Your magic doesn't work at all as long as you're wearing those shackles. But the captain, he's not just sick, wizard. He's cursed. That was interesting, and explained several things I'd observed. What kind of curse? The kind that comes from stealing things that weren't meant to be stolen. About 5 years ago, the captain led a raid on a merchant ship carrying what we thought was just another treasure shipment. Turned out to be artifacts from some ancient underwater temple. Things that had been resting on the seafloor for thousands of years. She paused, staring out the small window at the harbor below. We should have thrown them back into the sea, but they were beautiful and valuable, and the captain decided they were too good to waste. So we kept them, sold most of them to collectors in distant ports, kept a few of the prettiest pieces. And the curse started small, headaches, bad dreams, easy to ignore, but it's gotten worse, much worse. The captain's dying, and he knows it. The question is, what happens to the rest of us when he's gone? This was the heart of the problem. Captain Bloodtide wasn't just the leader of his crew. He was the cornerstone that held together an entire community. Without him, Dead Man's Cove would tear itself apart as different factions fought for control. 2 main groups, Isla continued. Gareth Red Sails leads the traditionalists, the ones who think we should go back to the old ways of piracy. Hit merchant ships, raid coastal towns, take what we want, and burn the rest. quick profits, high risks, but that's the life they signed up for. And the other group? That would be mine, she said with a grim smile. We think there are bigger threats out there than merchant marines and coastal militias. There's something in the deep waters. Something that's been attacking ships for the past few months. Merchant vessels, naval patrols, even some of the other pirate crews. Nobody's been able to get close enough to identify it, but the survivors all tell the same story. Something huge. Something that comes up from the depths and drags entire ships down into darkness. A sea monster. A kraken. Has to be. And as long as it's out there, hunting in our waters, none of us are safe. The shipping lanes are getting too dangerous to raid, and sooner or later it's going to come for us. I was beginning to see the scope of the problem. Both factions had valid points, and both were probably right about the consequences of the other's plan. The raiders would likely succeed in their attacks on defenseless villages, but would also bring down the wrath of every naval force in the region. The hunters might kill the kraken, but would probably lose half the crew in the attempt. What does Captain Bloodtide want to do? That's the problem. He can't decide. Or maybe he can't bring himself to choose which of his people live and which ones die. So he does nothing. And every day he waits, the situation gets worse. She stood up, preparing to leave. The captain wants to see you tomorrow. He's going to ask for your help. Ask you to use your magic to solve problems that magic probably can't solve. I just want you to understand, whatever you tell him, people are going to die because of it. After she left, I sat in the darkness of my chamber and considered my situation. I was a prisoner in a place where violent death was commonplace, surrounded by people who saw me as either a tool to be used or a threat to be eliminated. My magic was caged by iron and ancient runes, and even if I could escape, there was nowhere to run. But more than that, I was being asked to make choices that would determine who lived and who died, to pick sides in a conflict where both sides had legitimate grievances and reasonable fears. It was not a comfortable position for someone who preferred libraries to battlefields. Captain Bloodtide's private chamber was a study in controlled chaos. Maps covered every available surface, showing shipping lanes, naval patrol routes, the locations of prospective targets, and the territories claimed by rival pirate crews. Weapons hung on the walls, not for decoration, but within easy reach of a man who'd made countless enemies over the years. And in the center of it all, a massive desk carved from a single piece of driftwood, covered with reports, inventories, and the endless paperwork required to keep a community of 200 criminals functioning. The captain himself looked terrible. The tremor in his hands had gotten worse, and the lines of pain around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and constant suffering. But his mind was still sharp, and when he looked at me across that cluttered desk, I could see the intelligence that had kept him alive and in power for so many years. Isla told you about the curse, he said without preamble. She did. Then you know why I need your help. The question is, are you willing to give it? I settled into the chair across from his desk. as much as the iron shackles would allow. That depends on what kind of help you're asking for. The practical kind. My crew is about to tear itself apart, and when it does, a lot of good people are going to die for stupid reasons. I need to give them something to unite behind, some goal that makes sense to both factions. And you think I can help with that? You're a wizard. You understand things that normal people don't. Curses, sea monsters, the kind of problems that can't be solved with swords and cannon. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those dark, pain-filled eyes. Tell me about the kraken. So I did. I told him what I knew about such creatures, ancient beings that dwelt in the deepest parts of the ocean, normally solitary and territorial, not given to the kind of aggressive hunting that had been reported. I explained that most kraken attacks were defensive in nature, responses to threats or intrusions into their domain. So you're saying this thing is acting strangely? Based on what you've described, yes, krakens don't usually hunt merchant ships. They feed on whales, giant squid, creatures of the deep ocean. Attacking surface vessels suggests either desperation or what? Corruption. The same kind of magical corruption that's killing you. The captain was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. You think it's connected to the artifacts we took? I think it's possible. Those underwater temples weren't abandoned by accident. They were sealed for a reason. When you disturbed that seal, when you brought those artifacts to the surface, you may have released more than just a curse. Released what? Madness. The kind of ancient madness that turns protective spirits into rampaging monsters. I could see him working through the logic, understanding the connections I was suggesting. So, if we return the artifacts, if we put them back where they came from, the curse might be broken. The kraken might return to its natural behavior. Your crew might survive long enough to find a new leader. Might. I can't make guarantees about magic this old and this powerful, but it's the only solution I can think of that addresses both problems. The captain stood up, moving carefully to the window that looked out over his hidden kingdom. For a long time, he simply stood there, watching the activity in the harbor below. There's just one problem with your plan, wizard. Which is? The temple where we found those artifacts. It's guarded, not by traps or curses, but by something worse. Merfolk. An entire tribe of them. And they have very definite opinions about surface dwellers who steal from their sacred places. This was problematic. Merfolk were not generally hostile to humans, but they were fiercely protective of their territories and their religious sites. Anyone who had violated their temples would not be welcomed back, especially not if they were trying to return stolen property. How many? At least 50. Probably more. All armed with weapons designed to kill things underwater, where your people can't breathe or move properly. The captain turned back to face me. So here's the choice, wizard. We can try to hunt the kraken, probably lose half the crew in the fight, but maybe succeed and restore the shipping lanes to profitable raiding. Or we can try to return the artifacts. Definitely lose people to the merfolk guardians. but maybe break the curse and save whatever's left. Or we do nothing and watch everything fall apart as the crew destroys itself fighting over scraps. It was not an enviable choice, but it was the choice that had been forced upon us by circumstances beyond anyone's control. What do you want me to do? Help me convince my people that one of these plans is worth dying for, because right now, they're ready to die for pride and stubbornness instead. That night, Captain Bloodtide called a general assembly. Every member of his crew who wasn't on guard duty or essential ship maintenance gathered in the main hall, a natural cavern near the heart of the fortress that had been expanded and improved over the generations. 200 pirates, men and women from every corner of the known world, united by desperation and held together by the will of one dying man. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a sword, and I could see the careful way different groups positioned themselves, ready for violence if words failed to resolve their differences. Captain Bloodtide stood on a raised stone platform at the front of the cavern, with Gareth Red Sails on his right and Isla the Ironheart on his left. The symbolism was clear. He was still the leader, but his authority was balanced between two rival factions. "You all know why we're here," he began, his voice carrying easily in the stone chamber. "The situation has reached a point where we can't keep putting off hard decisions. We have problems, and those problems are going to kill us if we don't act." A murmur went through the assembled crew. Everyone knew about the kraken, about the failing raids, about the captain's declining health. What they didn't know was what he intended to do about it. "Gareth has a proposal," the captain continued. "He thinks we should return to traditional raiding, hit the fishing villages along the Mermaid's Rest coast, take what we need and establish our dominance in the region." Gareth stepped forward, his red hair catching the torchlight and giving him an almost demonic appearance. "The villages are defenseless," he said bluntly. "No walls, no professional soldiers, just fishermen and farmers who can't fight back. We take their food, their gold, their young people to sell in the slave markets. It's not glorious, but it's profitable, and profit keeps us alive." About half the assembled pirates nodded their agreement. These were the traditionalists, the ones who joined pirate crews expecting a life of raids and plunder. They understood the logic of Gareth's proposal, and they weren't particularly troubled by the moral implications. "Isla has a different idea," Captain Bloodtide continued. Isla stepped forward, her scarred hands clasped behind her back as she addressed the crowd. "The kraken is the real threat," she said firmly. "As long as it's out there, hunting in our waters, we're all living on borrowed time. It's already taken 3 merchant ships, 2 naval patrols, and the entire crew of the Bloodtide. Sooner or later, it's going to come for us." "So what do you suggest?" called out someone from the crowd. "We hunt it. We take our best ships, our best fighters, and we go after it before it comes after us. Kill the beast, and the shipping lanes open up again. Fail, and at least we die fighting instead of cowering." The other half of the crew, the ones who'd grown tired of running from every potential threat, voiced their approval. These were the veterans, The fighters who'd survived by taking the offensive against their enemies, but I could see the problem with both proposals. Gareth's plan would work in the short term, but would also bring down the wrath of every maritime power in the region. Isla's plan addressed the real threat, but would almost certainly result in massive casualties. Captain Bloodtide raised his hand for silence. "There's a third option," he said quietly. "One that might solve both problems, if we're willing to take a different kind of risk." He gestured toward me, and suddenly every eye in the cavern was focused on the chained wizard sitting in the shadows. Our guest has been studying the situation. He believes the kraken's behavior is connected to certain artifacts we acquired several years ago. Artifacts that were taken from a sealed underwater temple. A different kind of murmur went through the crowd. Everyone remembered that particular raid and the strange, beautiful objects they'd found in the merchant ship's hold. The wizard thinks that returning these artifacts, breaking the seal we inadvertently damaged, might end the curse that's affecting the kraken and other things. The implication was clear. The captain's illness, the growing tensions among the crew, the string of bad luck that had plagued them for months. All of it might be connected to those stolen temple artifacts. "But there's a catch," the captain continued. "The temple is guarded by merfolk, an entire tribe of them, and they're not likely to welcome back the people who robbed their sacred places." Gareth stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You want us to risk our lives, to return treasure we earned, based on the word of a prisoner who has every reason to lie to us?" "The wizard gains nothing by lying," Isla countered. "If his plan fails, he dies with the rest of us. His plan involves giving up our hard-won plunder and fighting merfolk in their own territory. How is that better than raiding fishing villages? Because it actually solves the problem instead of just postponing it." The argument that followed was heated and loud, and came dangerously close to becoming violent on several occasions. I watched from the shadows as 200 desperate people tried to decide which terrible choice offered the best chance of survival. In the end, it was Captain Bloodtide who restored order. "Enough!" he roared, and the sheer force of his personality cut through the chaos. "We're not making this decision tonight. Everyone goes back to their quarters, thinks about what's been said, and will vote tomorrow." As the crowd dispersed, I caught sight of the looks being exchanged between different factions. This wasn't over. The formal vote might be postponed, but the real decision-making was just beginning, and I suspected it wouldn't be settled with words. I didn't sleep well that night. The iron shackles made comfortable rest impossible. But more than that, I could hear the sounds echoing through the stone corridors of the fortress. Hushed conversations, footsteps in the darkness, the whisper of steel being drawn from sheaths. Something was building, some final confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in Dead Man's Cove. Around midnight, Isla appeared at my door. "Can't sleep either?" she asked quietly. "Hard to rest when you can hear people preparing for war." "It's not war yet, but it's close." She settled into the room's chair, her hand resting casually on the hilt of her sword. Gareth's been talking to his supporters. They think the captain's lost his mind, that he's so desperate to break his curse that he'll sacrifice the entire crew on the word of a prisoner. And what do you think? I think the captain's dying. I think the kraken is real. And I think your plan, dangerous as it is the only one that addresses both problems, even if it costs lives. Lives are going to be lost no matter what we do. The question is whether those deaths accomplish something, or whether they're just waste. There was a sound in the corridor outside, footsteps moving quickly and quietly. Isla tensed, her hand tightening on her sword hilt. "Stay here," she whispered, moving toward the door. "Whatever happens next, don't get involved unless someone tries to kill you directly." She slipped out into the corridor, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that the fragile peace holding Dead Man's Cove together was about to shatter. The sounds that followed were chaotic. Shouting voices, the clash of steel on steel, the wet sound of blades finding flesh. A battle was being fought in the stone corridors of the fortress, but I couldn't tell who was winning. Then, silence. A silence that stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, footsteps approached my door, slow, measured steps that suggested either victory or defeat, but not the chaos of ongoing battle. The door opened to reveal Captain Bloodtide, but not the man I'd been speaking with hours earlier. This version of the captain was covered in blood, his clothes torn and his weathered face marked with fresh cuts. But his eyes held a clarity I hadn't seen since our first meeting. "It's over," he said simply. "What's over?" "The debate." Gareth tried to force the issue. Came at me with a dozen of his supporters. Thought he could take control of the crew by killing the captain they see as weak and indecisive. And he was wrong. About the weak part anyway. The captain moved carefully to the room's window, looking out over the harbor where torches were burning and people were moving with urgent purpose. Gareth's dead. So are 8 of his closest supporters. The rest of his faction, they're reconsidering their position. "So you've won?" "Won?" The captain laughed, a bitter sound that held no joy. "I've survived. That's not the same thing." He turned back to face me, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The fight had cost him, probably more than he could afford in his weakened condition. "But it means we can move forward with your plan, return the artifacts, try to break the curse, hope that enough of us survive to rebuild afterward." "Are you sure? This isn't a decision you can unmake once it's started." "I'm dying, wizard. slowly, painfully, and probably sooner than anyone realizes. If there's a chance your plan can save my people, then it's a chance worth taking. He moved toward the door, then paused. We leave at dawn. 3 ships, 60 volunteers, and whatever hope you can offer us. I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day. After he left, I sat in the darkness and wondered what I had gotten myself into. In a few hours, I would be part of an expedition to return stolen artifacts to their underwater temple, fighting through merfolk guardians, risking everything on the hope that breaking an ancient curse was worth the lives it would cost. But what choice did I have? Gareth was dead, but his supporters were still alive and still angry. Isla's faction controlled the fortress for now, but that control was fragile and temporary. If we didn't act soon, if we didn't give the remaining crew something to unite behind, Dead Man's Cove would tear itself apart from within. Sometimes, the only way forward is through the storm. Dawn came grey and cold, with fog rolling in from the open sea to shroud the harbor in ghostly mist. 3 ships waited at the dock. The Wind Cutter, the Storm Dancer, and the Kraken's Bane, loaded with supplies and crewed by 60 of the bravest or most desperate pirates in Dead Man's Cove. Captain Bloodtide stood on the dock, looking older and frailer than ever in the pale morning light. But his voice was steady as he addressed the volunteers. "You all know what we're attempting," he said. "It's dangerous, probably deadly, and there's no guarantee it'll work. Anyone who wants to change their mind, now's the time." No one moved. These were people who'd chosen this life knowing the risks, and they weren't about to back down when their captain needed them most. "The artifacts are in the hold of the Wind Cutter," he continued. 7 pieces, each one beautiful enough to buy a palace, each one worth more than most of you will see in a lifetime. We're going to take them back where they came from, and hope that's enough to appease whatever powers we offended. Isla stepped forward, addressing the crews. "The temple is 3 days' sail southeast, in the deep waters beyond the Siren's Teeth. It's guarded by merfolk, at least 50 of them, probably more. They have weapons designed for underwater combat, and they know their territory better than we know ours." "So what's the plan?" asked someone from the crowd. "Simple," Captain Bloodtide replied. "We sail to the temple site, dive down with the artifacts, place them back where they belong, and try not to die in the process." It wasn't much of a plan, but then, some situations don't lend themselves to clever strategies and careful preparation. Sometimes you just have to charge forward and hope for the best. My own shackles had been modified, the chain lengthened and the weight reduced. I still couldn't use my magic, but I could move freely enough to be useful during the expedition. Captain Bloodtide wanted me close, both for my knowledge of magical artifacts and as a witness to what we hoped to accomplish. "You still think this will work?" he asked quietly as we boarded the Wind Cutter. "I think it's our best chance," I replied honestly. "But magic this old, this powerful, it doesn't always behave the way we expect it to." The captain nodded grimly. "Then we'd better be prepared for surprises." The 3-day voyage to the temple site was tense. Not because of weather or enemy sails on the horizon, but because of what we carried in the windcutter's hold. The artifacts themselves seemed to radiate a malevolent presence, a cold that had nothing to do with the ocean wind, a weight that pressed down on everyone who came near them. I spent most of the journey studying the pieces, trying to understand their nature and their connection to the curse that was killing Captain Bloodtide. They were beautiful, certainly, carved from some kind of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Temple guardians, I finally concluded on the second day. These aren't treasures, they're keys. Magical locks that were meant to keep something sealed away. Keep what sealed? Isla asked. She'd been helping me examine the artifacts, her scarred hands careful not to touch them directly. I'm not sure. Something old. Something that was dangerous enough that an entire civilization decided it needed to be locked away forever. And we broke the lock. We took part of it, which is almost as bad. The implications were staggering. If these artifacts were indeed part of some ancient containment system, then removing them hadn't just triggered a curse. It had weakened a prison that had held for thousands of years. What happens if we can't put them back? Isla asked quietly. I looked out over the dark water, thinking about the kraken that was even now hunting somewhere in these depths, about the madness that was spreading through Captain Bloodtide's body and mind, about the growing instability that was tearing apart everything these people had built. Then the curse continues, I said finally, and whatever was locked away finishes breaking free. On the third day, we reached the temple site. The water here was different, darker, colder. It moved in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or current, and when you looked down into its depths, you could swear you saw things moving that were too large and too strange to be natural sea life. There, Captain Bloodtide pointed to a section of water where the surface seemed to shimmer with an oily, unnatural light. The temples directly below, maybe 200 feet down, deep enough that you need magic to breathe, shallow enough that a good diver can reach it. Have you been down there since the original raid? Once, about a year ago, when the headaches first started getting bad. Thought maybe if I saw the place again, understood what we'd taken, I could figure out how to undo it. And I barely made it back to the surface alive. The merfolk, they're not just guarding the place. They're afraid of it, terrified, and anything that scares merfolk that badly. He didn't need to finish the thought. Merfolk were creatures of the deep ocean, comfortable with darkness and pressure and the kind of predators that would tear a human apart without effort. If they were afraid of something in that temple, then it was something that even surface dwellers should fear. How do we get down there? Asked Marcus, the young pirate who'd survived the power struggle back at the Cove. None of us can hold our breath for 200 feet. Magic, I said simply. If the captain removes my shackles, I can cast breathing spells on the entire diving party. But the moment these shackles come off, I'll have my power back, and your captain will have to trust that I won't use it to escape, or to turn the merfolk against you. or to simply let you all drown while I swim to safety? Captain Bloodtide was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks. "If I free you," he said finally, "what guarantee do I have that you'll help us instead of helping yourself?" "None," I admitted, "except that if this curse isn't broken, if whatever was locked in that temple finishes breaking free, then everyone in these waters is doomed, including me. That's not much of a guarantee. It's the only one I can give." The captain studied me with those pain-filled eyes, trying to read the truth in my face. Finally, he nodded to Isla. "Remove the shackles." The moment the iron chains fell away, I felt my magic flood back into my body like water rushing into a dry riverbed. It was intoxicating. For 3 weeks I'd been caged, helpless, dependent on others for everything. Now suddenly I had power again. I could have killed them all with a thought, could have summoned storms to sink their ships, could have called sea monsters to drag them down into the depths, could have simply teleported away and left them to face the consequences of their own actions. Instead, I began preparing the spells that would let us all breathe underwater. "Why?" Captain Bloodtide asked quietly as I worked. "Why help us? Why not just escape and let us deal with our own problems?" I paused in my spellcasting, considering the question. "Because," I said finally, "some problems are too big for any one person to solve alone. And because you trusted me when you didn't have to. That means something." The breathing spells were complex, requiring precise adjustments for each person's lung capacity and diving experience. But within an hour, I had 20 volunteers ready for the underwater journey, including Captain Bloodtide, Isla, and myself. "Remember," the captain addressed the diving party as we prepared to enter the water, "we're not there to fight. We're there to return what we took and get out alive. If the merfolk attack, we defend ourselves. But our goal is to reach the temple, place the artifacts back where they belong, and hope that breaks the curse." "And if it doesn't work?" asked Marcus. "Then at least we'll die knowing we tried." The descent into the dark water was like entering another world. The breathing spell allowed us to extract oxygen directly from the seawater, but it couldn't protect us from the pressure, the cold, or the crushing sense of isolation that comes from being surrounded by an element that wants to kill you. 20 feet down, 50, 100. The sunlight faded to a dim blue glow, then disappeared entirely. We swam by the light of magical torches that burned with cold fire, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed in the current. At 150 feet, we saw the first signs of the temple. Stone columns rising from the seafloor like the ribs of some massive buried beast. Carved walls covered in the same painful symbols that decorated the artifacts we carried. And everywhere, the sense of something vast and malevolent pressing against the barriers that held it contained. But it was the merfolk that made my blood run cold. They were waiting for us, not attacking, not fleeing, but simply watching from behind coral formations and rocky overhangs. Their pale, scaled bodies moved through the water, with an grace that made our clumsy swimming look pathetic by comparison. And their weapons, tridents and harpoons designed for underwater combat, were held ready, but not yet raised in threat. "They know why we're here," I said quietly, my voice carrying through the water magic that let us speak. "How can you tell?" "Because they haven't killed us yet." We swam deeper, following the temple's perimeter until we found the main entrance. It was a massive archway carved with protective symbols, but the symbols were cracked, broken, incomplete. Someone had damaged them deliberately, or perhaps they'd simply weakened over time as the magical barriers they represented began to fail. "This is where we took the artifacts," Captain Bloodtide said, pointing to 7 empty niches set into the archway's frame. They were beautiful. Even underwater, they seemed to glow with their own light. I examined the empty spaces, noting the way they were positioned, the connecting lines carved between them, the overall pattern they would have formed when complete. A containment grid, I concluded. The artifacts weren't just decorations. They were part of the temple's defensive system. Removing them was like taking stones from a dam. And what's on the other side of the dam? I looked past the broken archway into the temple's interior, where something massive moved in the darkness beyond our torchlight. Let's hope we don't have to find out. Replacing the artifacts was surprisingly simple. Each piece fit perfectly into its designated niche, sliding home with a satisfying click as ancient mechanisms engaged. As each artifact was restored, the carved symbols around the archway began to glow with soft, protective light. But it was the 7th and final piece, a carved figure that Captain Bloodtide had kept for himself, that triggered the real change. The moment it clicked into place, the entire temple shuddered. Light blazed from every carved symbol, racing along the stone corridors in complex patterns that hurt to follow. And from somewhere deep within the structure came a sound, a roar of rage and frustration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the seafloor. "It's working," I breathed. "The containment is being restored." But our celebration was premature. The blazing light that now surrounded the temple had attracted attention from the depths, and that attention was rising toward us with terrifying speed. The kraken. It emerged from the darkness below like a nightmare made flesh. Tentacles thick as ship masts, eyes like burning coals in a head the size of a small building. This was the creature that had been hunting in these waters. Driven mad by the weakening of the temple's containment, compelled to destroy anything that came near the source of its torment. But as the last artifact clicked into place, as the temple's protective barriers flared back to full strength, something changed in those burning eyes. The mindless rage faded, replaced by what almost looked like relief. The kraken stared at us for a long moment, its massive form suspended in the water just beyond the temple's entrance. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and swam back into the depths from which it had come. "It's over," Captain Bloodtide said quietly. "The curse is broken." But he was wrong. Oh, the kraken was gone, and the temple was sealed once more. But breaking a magical curse isn't like healing a physical wound. The damage that had been done to the captain's body, to the crew's unity, to the delicate balance that had held Dead Man's Cove together, that couldn't be undone with a simple restoration of stolen artifacts. As we swam back toward the surface, I could see the truth in Captain Bloodtide's face. The curse was broken, but the man it had been killing was beyond saving. Captain Bloodtide died 3 days after we returned to Dead Man's Cove. Not from the curse. That had been broken when the artifacts were restored, but from the accumulated damage of months of magical corruption eating away at his body and mind. Breaking the curse had stopped the progression, but it couldn't undo what had already been destroyed. His death was peaceful. He slipped away in his sleep, in the chamber he'd ruled from for so many years, with the knowledge that his people would survive without him. But survival isn't the same as thriving, and the death of the man who'd held Dead Man's Cove together for 2 decades left a vacuum that couldn't be easily filled. Isla tried. She had the respect of most of the crew, the intelligence to make hard decisions, the strength to enforce them when necessary. But she also had enemies, survivors of Gareth's faction who blamed her for their leader's death, traditionalists who thought a woman couldn't lead a community of pirates, opportunists who saw her rise to power as their chance to seize control for themselves. The second mutiny came just 2 weeks after Captain Bloodtide's funeral. It was smaller than the first, only 20 men, but it was also more focused. Instead of trying to take the entire fortress, they went after the supply ships, the vessels that brought food and fresh water to the island community. Control the supplies, control the people. Ila's response was swift and brutal. She led a boarding party personally, fighting hand-to-hand on the decks of the supply ship while arrows flew around her like deadly rain. By the time the battle was over, 15 of the rebels were dead, 3 had surrendered, and 2 had escaped to spread word of her victory. But victories like that come with a cost, and the cost was the gradual transformation of Dead Man's Cove from a community of pirates into a military dictatorship held together by fear and force. This isn't what the captain wanted, Isla told me the night after the second mutiny. We were sitting in what had once been Bloodtide's private chamber, now converted into her command center. Maps and reports covered the desk, but so did weapons, always within easy reach. What did he want? A place where people could be free, where they could make their own choices, live by their own rules, build something that wasn't controlled by kings or nobles or anyone else who thought they had the right to decide how other people should live. And now I spend my days making sure people follow my orders, whether they want to or not. Because if I don't, if I show any sign of weakness, the whole thing falls apart. It was the fundamental problem of leadership, especially leadership of people who'd chosen a life outside conventional society. The very independence that made them valuable followers also made them potential rebels. And maintaining control over such people required a constant balance between authority and accommodation. A balance that was easy to lose and almost impossible to regain. There's another option, I said quietly, which is leave, all of you, scatter to different ports, different crews, different lives. Dead Man's Cove has served its purpose, but maybe it's time to let it die with dignity instead of watching it slowly destroy itself. Isla was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities that she'd probably been thinking about but hadn't been willing to voice. And go where? Do what? These people, they don't have other options. Most of them can't go back to the lives they left behind, and they don't have the skills or connections to start over somewhere else. Some do. Some, but not all. And I won't abandon the ones who need protection. It was an admirable sentiment, but it was also a trap. As long as Isla felt responsible for every person in Dead Man's Cove, she would be bound to this place, forced to make increasingly harsh decisions to maintain the order that kept them all alive. "What about you, wizard?" she asked. "What will you do now?" I looked out the window at the harbor below, where ships came and went with the tides, carrying news and goods and people seeking their fortunes on the wide seas. "I'll leave," I said simply. "My business here is finished, and there are other places that need what knowledge I can offer." "The captain freed you from your shackles. You could have escaped any time after that, but you stayed to help us complete the mission. Why?" It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself during the long nights since our return from the temple. "Because," I said finally, "some obligations transcend law or custom. Captain Bloodtide trusted me, and that trust deserved to be honored. Even after he was dead. Especially after he was dead." Isla nodded slowly, understanding something that many leaders never learn, that trust, once given and accepted, creates bonds that survive even death. That honor isn't about following rules. It's about keeping faith with people who chose to depend on you. "Will you take anyone with you when you leave?" I thought about it. About the young pirates like Marcus, who might still have a chance at lives outside this doomed community. About the older ones who'd grown tired of the constant struggle for survival. About the skills and knowledge I could share with people willing to learn. "Anyone who wants to come," I said finally. "But I won't take anyone who's just running away. The world outside is hard in different ways, and it doesn't have much patience for people who can't adapt." I left Dead Man's Cove on a foggy morning 2 weeks later, aboard a small merchant vessel that had come to trade for supplies and information. 17 people came with me, mostly younger members of the crew, who still believed they could build lives somewhere else. Marcus was among them, so was Thomas, the former carpenter who'd brought me meals during my captivity. A few others whose names and faces had become familiar during my month of imprisonment, but most stayed behind. They stayed because Dead Man's Cove was the only home they'd known for years, because Isla needed their support to maintain order, because the devil you know is often preferable to the devil you don't. As we sailed away through the hidden entrance passage, I looked back at the fortress that had been my prison and my shelter. Smoke was rising from the workshops where craftsmen continued their trades. Ships were moving in the harbor as crews prepared for new voyages. People were going about the business of living in the only way they knew how. It looked normal, peaceful even, like a thriving community that had found its place in the world. But I knew better. I knew about the tensions simmering just below the surface. the growing authoritarianism required to keep order, the slow decay that comes when a community's founding principles are gradually abandoned in favor of survival. Dead Man's Cove would endure for a while longer, maybe years, maybe decades. But it would never again be what Captain Bloodtide had envisioned, a place where people could be truly free. Some dreams die hard, but they do die. The people who left Dead Man's Cove with me scattered to the winds within a year. Some found work on merchant ships, others apprenticed themselves to craftsmen in distant ports. A few even went back to the lands they'd originally fled, hoping that time had healed old wounds and forgotten old crimes. Marcus became a ship's navigator, his quick mind and steady hands making him valuable to captains who needed someone they could trust with their vessel's safety. Thomas used his carpentry skills to build boats in a small fishing village, living quietly and peacefully until old age finally claimed him. As for me, I returned to my wandering ways. The knowledge I'd gained about ancient curses and magical containment proved useful in several subsequent adventures, though none quite as dramatic as the mutiny at Dead Man's Cove. But sometimes, on cold nights, when the wind carries the smell of salt and distant shores, I think about Isla and the people we left behind. I wonder if she ever found a way to lead without becoming a tyrant. If the community ever found a new equilibrium. If Dead Man's Cove still exists in some form, I could find out, I suppose. A scrying spell or a conversation with the right traveling merchant would give me answers to those questions. But some stories are better left unfinished. Some endings are better imagined than observed. What I learned during that month of captivity was that people are capable of remarkable things, both terrible and wonderful, when they're pushed to the edge of survival. That honor and betrayal often exist side by side in the same heart. That leadership is sometimes about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. And that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is trust someone who has every reason to betray you. The fire has burned low while I've been telling this tale, and the night has grown deep around us. Can you smell that? The salt on the wind, the distant promise of storms and far shores, the memory of a time when the world seemed larger and more dangerous. Dead Man's Cove is gone now. I know that much from travelers' tales and merchants' gossip. The fortress stands empty, claimed by tide and weather and the slow patience of stone. Whatever became of Isla and her people, wherever they went when they finally abandoned the dream that had sustained them, it's their story to tell, not mine. But the lessons remain. The understanding that freedom and security are always in tension, that leadership requires choices that change the person making them, that sometimes the price of survival is becoming something you never intended to be, and the knowledge that trust, real trust, is the rarest and most valuable treasure in any world. So rest well, dear traveler. May your dreams be filled with fair winds and friendly harbors. May you always find trustworthy companions for dangerous journeys. And may you never have to choose between the lives of people you care about. The fire will burn through the night, keeping the darkness at bay, keeping the memories warm until morning comes again.